Welcome to our event this evening. I just want to welcome our online participants. We're going to get started here in just a minute, but I just want to thank everyone who's here for coming tonight. I think we're ready to get started, yeah? So my name is Paul Fagan. I'm the McCain Institute's director of the Democracy Program. We're a proud member of the ASU family, and we're joined here tonight in partnership with the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is part of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you again for joining this event, AI and the 2024 elections, navigating a messy information space. We have a great lineup of speakers tonight. I'll be your MC. And I'll introduce our speakers as the panels come up. Just a little bit about the McCain Institute itself. As I said, we are part of Arizona State University. We are a nonpartisan organization inspired by the late Senator John McCain and his family's dedication to public service. Our programs defend democracy, advance human rights, and empower character-driven leaders. Our unique power to convene leaders, as you'll see tonight, across the global political spectrum enables us to make real impact in the world's most pressing challenges. Our goal is action, not talk. And like Senator McCain, we are fighting to create a free, safe, and just world for all. Now, as part of setting the scene for tonight, and we'll have another speaker set in even the real agenda, but for tonight's discussion, I had a little help from ChatGPT because we are talking about AI, and I felt like, why don't I use it? I know this is like part of a lot of people's shtick these days, but I think a lot of people use it and it can be helpful. So I used it to develop some talking points about the pros and cons of using AI. And in elections, what are the pros and cons? And this is what I was given. So, and we'll evaluate whether this is true, not true, even killed after the event tonight. So the pros of AI in elections. 1, increased efficiency in data analysis. I think we'll hear a lot about this tonight. AI can analyze vast amounts of data quickly, and campaigns can target voters more effectively, ensuring resources are used efficiently. 2, enhance voter engagement. AI-driven chatbots and social media tools can improve voter outreach and answering questions, providing personalized voting information, and reminding people to vote, which we actually need people to do. This can help increase voter turnout, especially among young and tech-savvy voters. 3, election security, which is a big topic these days. AI can help in detecting patterns of cyber attacks, election interference by monitoring digital activities. We'll hear more about that tonight. Identifying unusual behaviors in real time. This contributes to safeguarding the election integrity by flagging potential threats. Number 4, streamline administrative processes. Voting and electioneering is a huge administrative process. AI can automate administrative tasks such as voter registration, poll working, poll station management, and vote counting. This reduces human error and speeds up the process, making elections more efficient and transparent. Now, what are the cons of AIs in elections? This is what ChatGPT also came up with. I don't know if this is a good thing that I'm talking about, but it is a big topic for everyone. The potential bias of algorithms. AI systems are only as unbiased as the data they are trained on. If AI is used to shape campaign strategies for voter targeting, it may unintentionally reflect or reinforce existing biases, leading to unfair advantages or voter suppression. The spread of misinformation. We hear a lot about this, something that in the McCain Institute we're very concerned about, spread of mis and disinformation. AI can be weaponized to create deep fakes, automated disinformation campaigns, and manipulate social media algorithms to spread false narratives. This can distort voter perceptions and influence election outcomes. Privacy. We all are concerned about privacy, but we live by our phones, we live by technology, but there's still a lot of concerns about AI and privacy. The use of AI for voter targeting often relies on collecting and analyzing personal data, which can raise significant privacy issues. Voters may not fully be aware of how their data is being used and leading to concerns over surveillance and data misuse. And continuing on the cons is the impact on election integrity. Over-reliance on AI where processes like vote counting or voter verification could result in technical glitches and system malfunctions. If it's not properly monitored or audited, AI systems could lead to errors and undermine trust in elections. So in conclusion, while AI offers significant benefits in improving efficiency, engagement, and security in elections, it also introduces challenges related to bias, misinformation, and privacy. So to fully harness the power of AI, we need a balance of innovation with strict regulations and oversight to protect the integrity of the democratic process. So there I had some help from AI, but I think a lot of that, we'll discuss tonight. But I'm going to really turn it over to our partner in crime here, Brett Schaefer from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, German Marshall Fund. And he's going to do an agenda-setting presentation. So Brett is a senior fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's been there for several years, and he manages its Hamilton 2.0 platform, which I'm sure he'll be talking about. So over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Paul. So tonight we're talking about AI and elections, but I'm actually going to start with an example that has nothing to do with either of those things. So this is the story of the Shed at Dulwich. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Shed at Dulwich, it was a restaurant that popped up in London around 2017, and it built itself as this sort of very avant-garde speakeasy. So there wasn't even an address listed online. You had to call if you were lucky enough to get a reservation. You were met at a street corner. You were sort of whisked away for this sort of very exclusive dining experience. So very quickly, it became a hot restaurant. It was getting 5-star reviews and 5-star reviews. And within about a half year, it became the #1 rated restaurant in the city of London on TripAdvisor. So like most hot restaurants, it was almost impossible to get a reservation. And in fact, it turned out it was literally impossible to get a reservation because the restaurant did not exist. The entire thing was a hoax pulled off by a Vice UK reporter to show how vulnerable online ranking systems are to manipulation. So why do I start here? This is an example of one person who had no real resources, no technical expertise, no money, didn't have the advantages of AI, and yet he was able to game the most trusted restaurant review site in one of the largest cities in the world and take a restaurant that didn't even exist and make it the most popular one, at least online. So now let's step back and think that the threat actor isn't actually a journalist playing a prank, but maybe it's a political operative, it's an extremist group, maybe it's a nation state. And the target isn't a restaurant review site, but it is maybe an ethnic minority group, political opponent, maybe democracy itself. And so when you throw AI into the mix, that I think is why we're seeing alarmist headlines like this. But I would note that these headlines aren't actually from 2024. They're from the last 3 major US elections. So these are from 2018, 2020, 2022. They all predicted this sort of tsunami of deepfakes, and it didn't materialize. So why does now feel different? Well, partly because we are starting to see deepfakes come into play in elections around the world. So we saw it in Argentina, we saw it in India, perhaps most notably, we saw it in Slovakia, where a few days before the election, there was a piece of synthetic audio leaked online that purportedly had one of the candidates saying they were going to rig the election. It also had the candidate saying they were going to raise the price of beer, which was arguably a bigger problem for him in his campaign. But the other reason I think that we are starting to have this fear of deepfakes overtaking elections is because now the technology is widely accessible and available. So anyone could create a video like this.
Hi, I'm an AI impersonation of Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. 2024 is a critical year. Angesichts der wachsenden Herausforderungen, vor denen Demokratien stehen, ist es umso wichtiger, dass wir uns hier beim Brüsseler Forum versammeln. Heureusement, Brett va aller au fond des 3 questions les plus urgentes. Premièrement, Taylor Swift et Travis Kelce se marieront-ils cette année? Повторить выборы Германия Кубок Европы. Infine, chi vincerà l'Eurovision quest'anno? Tossing back to Brett for this important discussion. And in case it wasn't clear, I'm not Adrian Fontes. This is an AI-generated deepfake. Good luck out there.
So there you have the Secretary of State sitting there saying things he never said in languages he does not speak. So that was actually something we cut together for an event several months ago. So the content made a little more sense there. But we show it just to show how easy it is to pull this together. And so how is this technology different from what we had 10, 20, 30 years ago? If you remember the movie Forrest Gump, there's this famous scene where Tom Hanks meets with Presidents Kennedy, President Nixon. That took the best visual effects artists in the world a month to create about a minute scene. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We cut this video with about 10 minutes, no money, and a few staffers. So it has really collapsed the technical needs, the technical abilities that are needed to create very believable, effective manipulation. So now time for a little pop quiz. So here are 4 images up on the screen. Who thinks they can detect the people who are real and the people who are AI generated? I'll give you a minute to look. If you guess B and C, you would be correct. And I know those people are real because that's my wife and brother. Another one. So this are 2 tweets. One actually created from Chinese state media, another created from ChatGPT, which I prompted to tweet out something in the voice of a Chinese state media outlet. So take a minute, read both of those, and see if you can see which one is real and which one is created through ChatGPT. So the answer was A. And then a final one. 2 images of French President Emmanuel Macron fleeing from protesters. Now this one is probably a little bit easier to detect which one is AI generated. So A is the real one. The reason I show it is not because the fake was so believable, it's because the disinformation campaign targeting the French president used the real image, it just took it out of context. This was an image from a year prior. They juxtaposed it with an event that happened a day before. We've seen this kind of manipulation as long as the internet has existed. So in some ways, I've been skeptical about the power of deepfakes to really have an impact around elections, just because the cheap fakes have always worked perfectly well. And frankly, what we're seeing still, it tends to be very low-tech, old-school manipulation that works perfectly fine. So where am I concerned about the impact of generative AI on elections and democracy more general? One, it's democratized the disinformation landscape. You don't need to have a nation-state sized budget to run a wide-scale disinformation campaign. It's improved the speed, the scale, and the volume of content that could be put out. So think back to the Russian Internet Research Agency. These were about 100 trolls sitting in an office building in St. Petersburg. Those same 100 trolls can now produce 10, 100 times the amount of content that they could, and it's going to be better. The English is going to be more accurate. The personalization is going to be better. So this is sort of Henry Ford in the assembly line. You're just producing more, and you're producing better quality. And that's the thing too. The targeting is getting more precise. So you don't need to know English if you're sitting overseas. Again, you run it through ChatGPT, you'll speak like a fluent Native American, or any other sort of ethnic group that you wanted to target. So just to show you an example of how this is actually being sort of borne out in propaganda campaigns that we are currently tracking. So here's an article from a site called Little Rock AR News, supposedly written by an author named Judy Allen. So our first clue that something was amiss here is that Judy Allen, the day that we spotted this, had published about 400 or 500 articles that day, which even in the modern media environment is pretty prolific. But the other thing we noted that was problematic is it looked almost identical to a Russian state media article that we'd seen published the day before. Then we did a little digging on Judy Allen and were able to determine that this person does not exist. It's an AI-generated image. And then we did a little digging around the internet and we found the same exact article on something called Albuquerque Breaking News. Different author, also doesn't exist, AI-generated image. And what we found was they were using very simple techniques to swap words in and out so that it would bypass Google and Bing's plagiarism detection. And so it appeared as if this were an original article. And once we had figured out the sort of process that they were using, we found 150 news sites presenting themselves as local American outlets that were rerunning Russian propaganda under the guise of being local journalism. But this was all very low tech. With ChatGPT, if they were a little bit more sophisticated, they could have targeted all of this to specific audiences. You take that same article and say, write it in the voice of a Trump supporter, a Black activist, write it in Spanish. And so as we look over the horizon, that's what I'm particularly concerned about. It's the real personalization, the customization of manipulation campaigns, of disinformation campaigns, targeted not just at groups, but at individuals. And when we look at the threat, I think we should start by looking at what the scammers are doing, because the scammers are always a little bit ahead of those running information manipulation campaigns. So you may have heard the story of parents being called and they hear their children, or what seems to be their children in the background, with somebody saying, "We've kidnapped your child," or somebody calling and saying, "Your loved one has lost their belongings in Europe," all to exploit loved ones to get them to send money. So you, of course, can think of the same techniques being used around elections to target election officials, to try to suppress the vote. And so again, I don't think that's coming this time. But as we look 4 years, 8 years down the road, that's what I'm particularly concerned about, are these very specific targeted attempts to manipulate voters or election officials. So just to wrap up, I want to give us one more chance to see if we do a little bit better at spotting the fakes. So there are 4 images. Who thinks they can tell which ones are actual food versus AI-generated food? How many people think one of those is real? 2? 3? Pretty good. So they're actually all real. And this is the trick and the thing I'm concerned about too. It's not so much that AI will get us to start believing in things that aren't real. It'll get us to start doubting the things that are real. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Brett. And I think we can all agree that all those AI-generated pictures and whatnot are still pretty frightening sometimes. But speaking of AI-generated people, I'm here to introduce our next panel, which is going to be with the Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I think we'll do it right up the two middle. And then Rachel Dean Wilson from the German Marshall Fund will do a fireside chat without the fireside chat. But we're excited that we have the Secretary of State and then an old McCain alum from the German Marshall Fund and Alliance for Securing Democracy. Over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Secretary Fontes. We're so happy that you are here for this important conversation. So let me get this
Glad to be here.
situated. Yes, thank you. So Brett presented quite the picture for us on the AI threats front. You sit in a very particular role here in the state of Arizona. And obviously you have, I don't know what your full day focus is, but most of it's got to be on elections at this point. How are you thinking about the threat of AI in our upcoming elections?
Well, AI is more of a vehicle than a new kind of threat. We've been facing misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation for quite some time in elections. In fact, American elections, going back to the beginning, have often, kind of played around a little bit with the truth here and there. Usually it's just a political thing based in the campaigns. Over the last couple of years, though, we've had the veracity of our elections challenged by a lot of these conspiracy theories and so forth. The nature of that is amplified by the potential that generative artificial intelligence presents. And we have also seen some of those tools emerge. The European example, we also saw it in New Hampshire during the primaries last spring. And so while we haven't seen a bunch of it materialize yet, what we do know is that the capacity and possibility of not only speeding up the bad information, but making it go broader and deeper than we can do it without those tools, that I think is the real threat.
Thank you. And you've really nationally emerged as a leader on this topic, doing some pretty unique trainings here in Arizona with election officials to try to get them to really wrap their heads around what this could look like in practice. Can you walk us through a little bit what those, why do those trainings and what they look at? Like, was there more AI generated Adrian Fontes at those perhaps?
Yeah, there's been a lot of deep fakes made of me recently. I am actually here. You could pinch me and I'd say, ouch. The reason we wanted to do this is it actually harkens back to some of the ways that we prepared ourselves back when I was in the Marine Corps, right? What you do is you look to the weapons and tactics of the enemy, the other side, so that if and when those things show up in real life, you're not wowed by them. You understand them a little bit better and you're familiar with them. So this is what we wanted to do. Elections officials and elections administrators have for a long time conducted what we call tabletop exercises. We see these in law enforcement, in the military. We've got a timeline that does not stop, and we want to be prepared for just about any scenario. So it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons for election nerds, right? We role play through a scenario. You know, the power goes out over here, this system goes down over there. This time what we did, though, is in December last year, we engaged a deep fake of myself, and we did a couple of other deep fake just audios. That the one of me was an audio and a video. And then we put them out there to the elections officials as part of the regular tabletop exercise. But we added this other dimension because if you think back a year ago, this sort of thing was really new, and it was just emerging in the election administration space as something people were thinking about. So what we wanted was our elections officials to at least be familiar with the notion of it, so that if and when it did show up in the real world during our our election season, they wouldn't be wowed by it. They wouldn't be surprised by it. It would be less impressive on them. They could get right back to the fundamentals, deal with the circumstance, and then move on. That's what we wanted to do. But we didn't just do it with elections officials. We did this same kind of training with law enforcement officials in 3 separate trainings throughout the state. And then we invited members of the media, local media and national media, to come in, mostly so that we could train them on what our processes looked like, but also so that we could have partners in the entire election administration space. And the training we did with our elections officials included emergency managers. It included our vendors. It included folks who were observing from the Department of Justice and from congressional offices. We wanted to make sure that folks understood we're taking all of this seriously, and the folks here in Arizona are going to be prepared. And I think so far we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love, and it's interesting, we do a little look at ASD, my organization, at what other countries are doing. They're successful in kind of building more resilient information space. And one of those examples is exactly what you're describing, that Sweden does quite well. I know at Brussels Forum, we talked about this a little bit, but where you're actually building out more stakeholders in your community that care about these elections. And I'm just curious, when you're having these conversations and you're doing these trainings with these different segments of society, like, what are the reactions? Were there any that stuck out to you when you're talking about this topic and kind of the ways it could be misused?
Well, it's interesting because knowing what's coming, I get to actually not be eyes on the screen, but I actually am eyes on the audience, eyes on the trainees. And some of the reactions are pretty interesting. I think the law enforcement folks were the ones who were most like, oh man, that's rough. Right, because I think they deal with sort of the not so great parts of our society a lot more than everybody else does. I mean, you know, and the media folks, they're just naturally a little more skeptical. So their reaction was a little different. But I think in every single group that we did and that we worked with, there were folks who were a little surprised. And I think there were folks who were a little bit worried. And the idea really was, let's get that surprise and that worry out of the equation as much as possible. Because when you've got this emotional reaction, you're not going to be able to think through the circumstances well. So that was really the notion behind this. But I think the best reaction I saw was a certain election official who will remain unnamed, who during the course of the exercise in one of the back rooms, we had one of our technicians that was helping us from Palo Alto. I can't remember the name of the institute. Did a 30-second training of an AI agent. That agent went and reproduced a deep fake using that short bit of time. And that election official was speaking German and Mandarin Chinese. And that person doesn't speak either of those languages. And the reaction was really like kind of hilarious. I mean, this person was shocked. And so, you know, sometimes that's the reaction, but you know what? That's kind of the space that we're operating in now. And we just kind of got to figure out ways to deal with it.
Yeah. And as we're eyes on the election, we've had a history where there have been quite the theories false theories around Arizona's elections. At ASC, we're tracking kind of emerging false narratives or potentially problematic narratives that could be used in the same way. Is there anything that's emerging around the Arizona elections right now that you find particularly concerning or that you're keeping an eye on? And how do you approach that? Are you pre-bunking or debunking? What's the strategy?
Well, so we haven't really seen anything that's of great concern right now around Arizona's elections. And we've still got several weeks, at least 3 weeks worth of early voting going on. For those of you out there in Arizona, vote early. It helps everybody. But you know, one of the things that we've done to pre-bunk and debunk, we've done with our AI advisory committee that I
That was the
created.
next question. Yeah.
That okay, well, I'll hold off on that a little bit. But one of the tools that we've actually engaged as part of our conversation is we actually have a website that shows some of the tools that are being used now to help folks recognize actual content. So if you go to a website, acm.azsos.gov, you'll be able to see some photographs that have a little icon where there's a digital fingerprint that exhibits the provenance of those images, and you can kind of show how you can sort of deep fake proof some media. Now, it's not all encompassing and it's sort of a little bit experimental, but we're trying to put some of the good uses of these technologies out there for folks to make sure that we have a balanced approach to this. As was indicated earlier, even ChatGPT admits that there are some useful spaces where AI can be employed, as much as there are some cautionary areas where we've got to be careful with what we do.
So these are authentic images.
They're authentic images.
That are watermarked.
They are
essentially.
watermarked. They've kind of got a digital fingerprint on them. There's a lot of different ways people are talking about this. And you can actually go put your icon or your pointer over the icon, and it gives you some information. Again, the website is acm.azsos.gov. Sadly, most of the images are of me, so I apologize ahead of time, but this is what we kind of wanted to put out there so folks would be able to see this. And maybe in future elections, you know, some of the scheming behind this is we might be able to create archives or catalogs so that the actual candidates will be able to use these tools on their own websites, so we can really get past some of the not so truthful stuff and find out what people are actually putting out there if that sort of thing becomes necessary.
Excellent. And do you know of any other secretaries of state who are doing similar, providing similar types of images, or are you kind of pioneering this?
You know, we're kind of at the forefront of some of this stuff, but at the same time, there's a lot of secretaries that have been able to work with their legislatures to get some you know, statutory changes on the books. I know California's done some stuff, Wisconsin, Colorado, some other states have really delved into this from that side. So it's kind of a shotgun approach around the country, what people are doing. I know we were the first ones to do a training, but we can't take credit for being the pioneers in every area, nor would we want to. It's a very collaborative effort, and folks are trying to adopt best practices as best as they can within their particular jurisdictions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's one of the strengths of having this this decentralized system too, is you can try different things in different states. So I kind of cut you off when talking about the AI committee, but you put together this Arizona AI committee that's people from tech companies and civil society. Full disclosure, I'm on the committee. But to look at this problem and really kind of advise you, but I'd love to hear the idea behind this committee and, you know, if it's changed how you're approaching this issue or how you're thinking about this issue.
So really what we wanted to do is kind of try to figure out what we were doing, right? Because this isn't kind of something that state governments across the country can just grapple on their own. I don't think anybody can grapple this on their own. So we did exactly that. We got some folks. We've got you're in from the German Marshall Fund. We've got folks from the Brennan Center. We've got some folks from the Academy, different colleges and universities. We've got folks from OpenAI, Google. I think Microsoft is in there, and some other tech companies. And together what we do is try to think through some of the issues and the ways AI can both be a benefit and a detriment to our election systems. And the conversations are phenomenal. And as you well know, my favorite part about this, I have to share this, is at the beginning of every meeting, we do a round robin, and everyone in the meeting gets to share for about 2 or 3 minutes what has happened in the world of AI since the last meeting. It is one of the most fascinating, mind-bending moments that you'll see. And I usually am exhausted by the time that part's over. But some of the things that we've produced, for example, is a one-pager on artificial intelligence and elections that if we haven't published yet, I think we'll be publishing out of the office real soon. And that really was a creation of the committee. We will also be convening, as you know, live here in Arizona sometime in the next couple of months. And then we'll be putting out a report at the end of that after the election season. So we really are bringing these folks together. The conversations are robust. And in some times we actually get to challenge one another. You know, folks in the academy will challenge some of the folks in the technology spaces. And we, in my office, with some of the staff that are on these meetings, we get to sit and listen and absorb a lot of this conversation and try to find ways that we can benefit not just the operation that we have, but the voters that we impact and taxpayers writ large, just to do our jobs better in this very rapidly changing landscape.
And this one pager that's coming out is like about navigating the information space. Where I get a lot of the times when we have this conversation, is it's really overwhelming for the individual. Like, what are you supposed to do to navigate this information space seriously? So what are your kind of tips just for the individual as they approach this election season? What should they be doing and thinking about to protect themselves and their families and communities from bad information or from AI tricks or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, let's kind of take a step back. We're really concerned about election administration and elections in the United States of America because we're engaged in what I like to classify as this slow rolling civics lesson. People are really learning about a space that we took for granted for a very long time in this society. And that's the silver lining. So I'll start with that positive piece. People are really engaged. That having been said, a couple of the tips are this. Go to trusted sources of information for your information. Your local election offices at the various counties that run the elections, particularly here in Arizona. We're a bottom-up state. You get a lot of great information there. Your secretaries of state, the National Association of Secretaries of State, these offices where you can get the information that you need about the time, the place, and the manner of your election so that you can execute those rights appropriately. The other thing that I think is really critically important is this. If you're getting a piece of information that invokes some kind of emotion inside of you, stop for a minute, take a breath, think about it. Think about the source of the information. That's always a good idea, no matter what the information is. We tend to kind of just look at the headlines and then move on. We need to be a little more responsible as consumers of information and use a little bit of caution. That to me is one of the most important things that we can do. Double, triple check, look around at things. But if something feels a little weird, chances are it probably is.
Yeah, that check your emotions piece is so critical, and the scams that Brett brought up totally play on your emotions, but that's when you make those less rational decisions. So I can't imagine the number of times you've gotten the question I'm about to ask you, but I think it's because it's the question: what keeps you up at night when you're thinking about things, challenges, potential problems in AI and elections? I'll scope it a little bit for you.
Yeah, that question is the center block on my bingo card for whenever I have conversations. I'll be honest with you. What keeps me up at night isn't anything necessarily in the AI space, in the technology space, in the election administration space. What keeps me up at night is that we still have elected officials and candidates in this country who will purposefully lie because of grift or because of some kind of political advantage that they think they're going to get. And they are the ones who are dividing us one from another based on lies, based on zero actual truth. And it keeps me up at night because what they're doing is eroding the civic faith that we as Americans should have in one another. That's the real issue that we're facing right now. Most of this corrosive information originates outside of the United States, but it's amplified by domestic actors. And that amplification is happening within our political system by people in power in many cases. And that's the real tragedy that we're facing right now. So to me, the greatest harm that we're experiencing is from within. But let's be clear, it's not, I think, originating from inside this country. What we have are foreign actors in Russia, in Iran, and in China who know they cannot defeat us militarily. They know they have nothing against us economically. They know that the only way that they can beat us as a nation is to keep us from being able to move forward together. Divided as we have started to become, that's when we're weakest as against their influence, as against their capacity to run their agendas in the rest of the world. We as a united United States are real powerful, and I think we're a real force for good. And that's what kind of bugs me, is that there are folks inside this country who are helping them with their agenda, completely not recognizing how useful they've become to those foreign enemies.
And it is interesting. They all have their own slightly different geopolitical goals, but it's a good day for Russia, China, and Iran when the United States looks divided and like democracy is a mess.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Speaking of international attention, Arizona, there's a lot of interest from our European colleagues and elsewhere in what is happening in this state.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of scrutiny, a lot of eyes. But what can you tell us about what is, if you had to point to one thing, Arizona's strength coming into the election, and what makes you feel good about how the election is going to come off, and what would you point to watch for those folks?
I'd say our greatest strength is our people. Those folks out there in our county election offices, the folks who are at the polling places helping voters, those folks out in the community who are helping register voters. Look, we still have amazing people doing the work here in Arizona. And the sad thing is, they're the ones that have been lied against. Their reputation, their integrity, their honor is what's being called into question, because, as you well know, Arizona's counties run our elections. There's no one person in control of anything. And those county election offices, the county recorder's offices, they're run by good people who are well-intentioned. They are our neighbors, they are our relatives, and we know them locally. And I believe in them because they have consistently run great elections in Arizona. And there's no proof otherwise, let's be clear. There's a lot of conspiracy theories otherwise. There's a lot of lying that goes the other direction. But these folks, under some of the worst pressure, under some of the worst lies, have continued to do honorable work. And I'm really proud to be one member of that greater team. And they're the ones that make me feel good. And they're the ones that make me continue to have a lot of hope that at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to get past all of this and we're going to be able to get along with getting along.
Great. All right. I have one more question for you. A lot of times, and I'm very guilty of this, we get fixated on election day. Just get to election day. We can make it to election day. Let's, check that process. But a lot of the mayhem, particularly on the information front, can take place after the election.
Yep.
So what are you looking at in that post-election period? And what would be your message for Arizonans as we head into that post-election period where disinformation can kind of bloom?
So a lot of the challenges, a lot of the legal stuff that's going to be happening after Election Day, I think, have been staved off by a judiciary that's paying close attention, and that has really helped. And let me just talk a little bit about that. Just the other day, the Arizona Supreme Court put out an administrative order basically telling all of the judges under their jurisdiction, so all of the state courts, elections cases will take precedence. You have a schedule that you've got to follow. We've got a priority that needs to be proceeded with. And so they've basically communicated to all of the bench in Arizona, this cannot be delayed. We cannot have legal cases that are just going to go on and on and on and on to mess things up. For example, for the Electoral College in the case of the presidency. Number one, that's a really solid thing that I think is going on right now to stave off any of those challenges. Number two, we've had some cases, some resulting in indictments, even some cases where my office was ruled against, where we have courts making very, very clear, not just in Arizona, but there was one recently in Georgia, when certification is supposed to be happening, that is a mandatory duty of the election boards. This is not discretionary. It is not something to be examined. The law is very clear on that. Our elections procedures manual is very clear on that. And so there's been a lot of preparation work for the potential challenges that could stymie the process insofar as certification and then some of the legal challenges. We've worked hard against those things. And we've been kind of gaming a lot of these things out with the Attorney General's office here in Arizona, as well as with the governor's office, just to make sure, and with the courts, of course, to make sure that whatever challenges pop up, we're going to be prepared to deal with them and move on. We know that our election systems are really good here in Arizona. They're not perfect. No one ever says they're perfect, but we run good elections. We have run good elections. We will continue to run good elections in the face of these challenges. So yes, post-election, we may see a lot of this kind of ugliness bubble up again, but I think we've done our level best to prepare for it. And I think all of our partners across the entire little d democracy space, including the various branches of government, are ready. And I think 2024 is going to be a story of success.
Great. Then let's leave it there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you to Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. Thank you for coming tonight. You were, I think, the epitome of what John McCain would say, serving a cause greater than oneself. We have Bill Gates in the audience. He's been to a lot of our events. And I think, our elections officials, more than ever, are our frontline workers, defending democracy. As you have said, and Bill has said, and so many have said, you're part of a team, a greater team. You might be the faces of the elections, but there's a team of people in our communities, aunts, uncles, grandparents, friends and neighbors, churchgoers that are running these elections. They are run by people. And it's so important, all of the things that you brought to the conversation here. But thank you for your service. Thank you for what you're doing for Arizona. And thank you for taking time, because you've got a busy couple of weeks ahead of you and probably a month.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you again. So we'll move on to our next panel, which I will be moderating. So this is our threat of AI in elections. So we had a practical discussion with the Secretary of State about, what is going on in Arizona, what are the threats here on the ground. But we're going to talk not necessarily about theoretical issues, but how individuals, and I'll invite our panelists up, Brett and Nadia Bliss, to talk about, also the national security threat. As Mr. Fontes said, probably a decade ago, elections officials wouldn't have thought that they would be getting briefings from the Department of Homeland Security, from national intelligence individuals about what threats they face from Russia, from China, from Iran, and other adversaries. So I want to welcome our panelists, Nadia Bliss and Brett Schaefer, for our next conversation. So just a quick introduction. So Nadia is the executive director of ASU's Global Security Initiative. And again, Brett is with the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. We're going to be talking about the threat of AI in elections. And I'm going to just open it up to both of you, and maybe first turn to Nadia, just for a couple minutes to set the scene, AI in elections. What are the threats? So over to you, Nadia. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and having me here. I believe I am clearly the nerd here this evening. So I just want to contextualize sort of my background and experience. I'm a mathy computer scientist with about 20 plus years of experience in national security R&D. So that's sort of the perspective that I'm talking from. I have lived in Arizona for the last 12 years working for ASU, and I will say that I absolutely love how our elections are administered. So I want to thank the Secretary of State. I just received my third or fourth text message that my ballot has been counted and my signature has been verified. I feel really good about that. Okay, so a couple things. I just want to say a few sort of core points and then go back over some of them, and please interrupt me at any point. Information space is really messy. There's lots of issues. We'll talk more about the fact that adoption of AI is happening very, very fast. And I think as a computer scientist, I would like to see some breaks on that process. However, our elections are secure. They're well administered, and I would say that, so my sort of top recommendation is always to trust the experts in the process. So I think checking sources continuously, I think that's a really important point. I do think let me hold this further away. Does that work better? Okay. I do think the foreign influence campaigns are real. I don't think we see, so from a technical perspective, voting is not really under threat. It's more the foreign influence operations and, again, the type of messaging that's out there. I do also think that part of the reason the information environment is as it is because the incentive structures are such that push us towards adoption of technologies and push towards engagement, as opposed to kind of validity of information. The one last point I will make is where we are with artificial intelligence right now is where we were with sort of cybersecurity more generally and social networking about 20, 25 years ago. There were lots of computer scientists at that time raising lots of concerns, but we went full in and adopted, and now we're in a whack-a-mole situation with cyber. I think we have an opportunity to be more proactive with AI, and I'll pause here.
Well, I think I'll pick up on the last point there, which is a little bit different, I think, when we look at AI for other technologies that have emerged over the last 30 years, where there's usually tech optimism. So something is rolled out, and the people who roll it out and the early adopters are looking at the benefits of it. And so I'll give you the example. I talked to someone at Meta about Facebook Live. And so Facebook Live, she was part of all the internal conversations, and everyone talked about, well, it's going to be amazing. Grandparents are going to be able to see their grandkids' birthdays, and you're going to be able to connect people. And it wasn't until the Christchurch shooting, where somebody Facebook Lived a massacre, that they said, oh, this could be a problem. Let's figure out some guardrails. AI, it feels like we're kind of doing the reverse. I don't know necessarily if that's going to be a good or bad thing, but it does seem like we're starting from, here are the threats we need to be prepared for, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to catch up with the technology. But it does feel like from the beginning, we are at least thinking through the potential misuses of the technology, and that's definitely different. Then a final point kind of on, and I touched on this in the presentation, sort of how we're seeing AI used currently and the concerns we have. And so I'll take the line from the recent report from the Foreign Malign Influence Center, which is the part of the government that sits the Director of National Intelligence. That looks...
Technology. Would you like this?
Yeah. That looks exclusively at foreign malign influence. So they can't touch the domestic, so they're only looking at state-backed actors. And their evaluation is that AI has improved and accelerated foreign malign influence campaigns, but it hasn't revolutionized them. So I don't think we should be particularly concerned about the deep fake of Trump or Harris. Again, I think the concern is this pollution in the information space. So if somebody has a narrative that is particularly problematic, it now seems as if it's coming from 50, 100, 200,000 different sources and can kind of drown out the competing voices who are not using manipulated information to get their message out. And so I think that's the challenge, right? Because we don't want trusted sources to use the same sort of manipulation techniques that the adversaries are using. However, the adversaries are gaming the system. And so it's the drowning out of the positive messages that I'm concerned about.
Yeah, Brett, I do like the fact that you brought up Facebook Live, and new technologies were always used, or were seen as positives. You know, the introduction of Facebook, the introduction of Twitter, just like the personal computer, everyone got excited. Those of us who have been working sort of in the democracy field for decades, saw how Facebook, Twitter, the World Wide Web really opened up information for people living under dictatorships, authoritarian countries. They had this new power, this information that there were no guardrails yet. Obviously, is what you said, that our adversaries and authoritarian countries have now figured this out, and that information has, it's been squeezed. But I think it's important as we talk about AI, and whether we're looking at it in this positive light or this negative light. But I'm going to open it and I'm going to start, some questions for our panelists. But I'm going to start with Nadia first. As you said, and I'm using your words, you're a nerd. You're a computer scientist. You're steeped in these national conversations around the development and impacts of emerging technologies like AI. What are you concerned about when it comes to AI's impact on democracy? And what do you think maybe be overblown?
So I guess I'll just start by saying, I think general skepticism about new technology is very healthy. So, I mean, often what people ask me is like, what do I do, in my house? And I am not on Facebook and have never been on Facebook. I just got Instagram in January because we got this really cool cat and it seemed like a good time to get Instagram. I'm not on TikTok, right? So skepticism about technology as a whole, I think is a very positive thing. And I think what I worry about is there's a lot of deployment and adoption of generative AI, which is ChatGPT is a part of, or an example of, without any breaks in the system. So I'm going to say, so I was actually in DC just yesterday, and I was at an event where the director of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency spoke, Dr. Stephanie Tompkins, and she made this point, which I just thought was brilliant, that you drive the slowest in the car with no brakes. And we're driving like full speed in a car with no brakes. That's kind of how I feel about AI. There aren't enough people. I see that you're observing skepticism, but there's lots of people just using it and adopting it and bringing it into their system. So worried about that. Really worried about long-term impact. And this is not just artificial intelligence, but broadly the veracity and volume of kind of the pollution of the information ecosystem and what that means for future AI systems. Because now we have these AI systems training on AI data, which potentially just erodes knowledge as a whole. And the other thing that's much closer, not further down the line, is just it has eroded trust in institutions. And that's very, very unfortunate. The other thing that I think worries me is there is a distinction between an open democratic regime and an authoritarian regime and how those technologies are deployed. Not really worried about administration of election. That does not worry me. I will just emphasize that that's why I always encourage people to almost do like a two-factor authentication with information. You can't do that with everything. Like you're not going to check that, the shoes you're going to buy from a website are the right shoes or whatever. You don't need to check that. But elections are important. So double check. Like if somebody says, polling places are closed today, go to the Secretary of State website. Don't trust whoever said that to you. They're not the expert in that.
You're just relaying, easy information that, we have these technologies at our fingertips. Let's use them and let's double check them. Brett, this whole event is around information and how messy it is, especially in the election space. You do a lot of work to make sense of some of this messy information, but is there a way to make it less messy? Is there a way to think about and categorize, AI in elections and make it less messy?
It's a challenging question. So We'll start with the sort of infrastructure of the internet right now, social media. When I started this job, my first major election I worked on 2018, we had to look at Twitter, we had to look at Facebook, a little bit YouTube. That was more or less it. I mean, we were broadly aware of some other platforms, but we weren't particularly concerned. Now there's 30, 40 you have to be aware of, and probably far more than that, actually, because there's very niche things that we have to be concerned about. So there's been a balkanization social media, which means there's just more spaces to monitor. And so it's actually harder. It's gotten much messier just because I feel like we have less of a sense now of what's really going on than when we only had to look at 2 or 3 platforms. So that's just inherently what it is right now. The challenge is, you know, Secretary of State Fontes said, like, we want people to go to trusted sources. To get people to trusted sources online, it requires the companies to make some decisions about what is and is not a trusted source, because it is not just going to be the algorithm that naturally surfaces to the top, quality information. I mean, we know this. And so the companies around elections have to say, we need to prioritize content that comes from election officials, trusted media outlets. That has become controversial in ways I wouldn't have predicted a few years ago. And back to 2020, we saw the tech companies do this. I mean, they had a lot of outreach with election officials. We did a bunch of work with Meta and Twitter to make sure that election officials' accounts were verified. Many of those efforts have been torn down or at least drawn back. And so I know this is not striking an optimistic note, but the only way to make sure that people who genuinely want to actually access accurate information, I'm not talking about the conspiracy theorists who want to go to the darker corners, people have real questions and Google it, to make sure that what is coming up is quality information, is for them to make some decisions about what is and is not quality information. And again, that has become politicized in ways that I think are really problematic. So I think we do need to pressure the companies through the various mechanisms we can, advertisers, everything else, to ensure at least around elections that they are taking an active role in making decisions about what should be prioritized, because if it's just left to the algorithms, we're not going to see the good information surface at the top.
It's interesting. So you're basically saying it's just going to continue to get messy until the adults in the room really kind of take ownership, and it has a lot to do with the tech companies. Nadia, go ahead.
Can I jump in on that just for a second? I mean, one thing that I would just say that as a consumer of information, important thing to remember is, so algorithms are just a bunch of math and they're optimized on a particular function. So for companies, that function tends to be, you know, advertisements or profits or engagement. It's not bad or good, it just is. So, you know, that's why, for example, I go to NPR for most of my news. If I see something that is really exciting, I will usually cross-reference it with NPR because that's public radio, different incentive structure. And I think just keeping that in mind, that sometimes that's entirely okay. Like I mentioned, I really enjoy cats. So my Instagram algorithm feeds me cats. That's fantastic. Like I love that. But not for election information. That's where you want to go to a place where the incentive structures are aligned to serve the information that is accurate and robust.
Let me throw this out there maybe to both of you. I'm going to go off script a little bit, but to your point of where people get their information, a couple of years ago, we did a poll here in Arizona of young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, and where they consume their news. Where do they get their news? Number 1, YouTube. This was 2 years ago. So maybe, you know, it's been inversed a little bit, but TikTok, Snapchat. So if you're talking to young people, I'm not saying that we're old, but if you're, but if you're talking to young people and saying, okay, go to do your two-factor two-factor, and they're gonna be like, okay, I'll go to YouTube and then I'll go to TikTok, or I'll go to TikTok and Snapchat. I mean, I'm talking, you know, I'm thinking about my teenage girls, and this is where they're consuming their information. So how do we get to the point where maybe like the Snapchats and others become a little bit more like NPR, where that we as the adults can trust that information? And maybe I'm overstepping the line here, where maybe Snapchat and some of these other platforms would say, we do provide this information, but I can tell you from personal experience, and you know, just children, they don't get this information very easily.
I think we all sort of wax poetic about the days where there were 3 evening news, and that's where everyone went. It's not coming back, so we should push that to the side. And you're right. I mean, to go to an audience of 18 to 22-year-olds and say, you need to start going back to legacy media that you've never looked at in your life and trust them, it's just not going to happen. It's not the reality right now.
Does NPR have TikTok? I don't know. I'm not on TikTok. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. PBS. Go to the PBS
Yes, that's
TikTok.
TikTok.
So, I mean, we have to meet people where they're at, right? And this is sort of a shameless plug, but what Rachel and I recently did a week ago or so in Pennsylvania is we convened a dinner of influencers, like actual influencers. And so these are lifestyle bloggers and everything else, and connected them with local and state election officials there, just so that they're in the same room. And so that the election officials, and this happened, could give out their cell phones, say, you know, hey, if you have a question about something that pops up around the election, reach out to me, because they know that then the influencer can reach out to their community. So I think we need to, and I struggle to do this because I'm not a fan of the sort of influencer community, but we need to look at them as sort of the new community activists, as new sources of media, and bring them into the fold. And, you know, it's hard because you're not dealing with 3 legacy media. You're dealing with a bunch of different spaces and individuals. But I do think we need to do whatever we can to just accept reality and bring in the people who are influential and who understand their communities online and off, and make sure that they have access to the election officials, to people who have accurate information, and let them do their thing and hopefully spread positive, accurate information and not conspiracy theories.
Just to emphasize that point, I mean, I really like that framing, because essentially what you're saying is go back to the experts, right? So will we be able to not have TikTok or Instagram or whatever the next thing will be? No, of course not. But we can absolutely encourage people to trust in expertise and go cross-reference with experts. I will say, so I have a 13-year-old. It is true that I've been talking to her since about this, and she's been in utero probably. She's very good at being like, is this real? And I'm like, well, let's check it out. And I mean, we can all do that, but at scale, I think getting the influencers to encourage referencing experts is really important.
I mean, it does really come back to home and working with kids, working, you know, with your communities to ensure you are really looking for, you know, factual information. I want to kind of go back a little bit. We've talked about sort of the international threat. Nadia, you talked in your opening remarks that you're not too concerned about, you know, the voting process, the election process here in the United States, because we trust our election officials. We have a couple of them here. They know what they're doing. You know, this is a process this country's been doing for more than 200 years. But we are now having to talk about this intersection of national security and elections. It wasn't as commonplace before. We know that, you know, Russia, USSR, and tried to influence elections, and there have probably been times the United States has tried to influence elections and political outcomes. So how has technology contributed to this shift, and how do we maintain vigilance against, you know, these threats and this information messiness?
Right. So a number of folks, and Secretary Fontes has talked about this as well. I mean, a lot of this stuff is not new. So propaganda, foreign influence campaigns have been around, but there have been, you know, 2 major inflection points. One with sort of rapid adoption of social networking, which allowed basically distribution of information on much wider networks much faster. And I think we're at another inflection point where now the generation of that information is incredibly inexpensive, and anyone can use this information. So are the foreign influence campaigns a threat? Absolutely. I think, again, as you can probably gauge, I do trust our institutions. So I think it's a good practice to cross-reference agencies that are responsible for these sort of things. Sometimes it's Department of Homeland Security, CISA, so Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence tracks these kind of things, so those people are aware of those threats. As an individual, like, no silver bullet. I'm going to come back to, maybe it's because I work in this space, but those news articles from Arkansas, like, they're obviously not real, right? I mean, that does not look like a trusted source by any means. So I think, and you have to be a little careful, because I do think in our communities, we have trusted parties. So you have to sort of apply that filter of like, okay, well, I'm not actually going to listen to what my mom is saying about what's happening. I'm going to go to either NPR or PBS or whatever news source that you consider is reliable.
Wrap it up, but I just want, no, you're good. But I just want to ask you one last question, just about, you've been tracking elections around the globe. You've seen some trends in AI usage, positive, negative. What can we Americans expect in the future? And how do we safeguard? There are also a lot of the states are making, developing laws about, tagging AI in campaigns and advertisements. So I'm just, wondering, as we're looking around the globe, what are some of these trends and how can we defend against them?
We actually haven't seen as much AI as I think everyone predicted for 2024. I mean, I gave a few examples, but they've been limited. And so particularly around the EU parliamentary election, the UK election, French elections, each one of those was sort of ramped up waiting for, again, the deep fake that would topple things. And it hasn't happened. So that leaves me a little bit optimistic, although I don't think we should let our guard down, because just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't happen. And so I don't know what to predict in 2 years, because the technology is going to move so fast. I have no idea what 2026 will look like. But I think for this one, I really don't expect there to be the October surprise of a deep fake. And if there is, frankly, I don't know if that's really going to move the needle. I don't think it's going to change many votes. So I'm relatively confident that we are prepared for it this year. And I make no predictions for 2 years.
No, but I appreciate that. I think both of you have painted a pretty positive and optimistic picture right now, that AI deepfakes haven't had this huge impact on our elections, on global elections, as people thought this year of elections, where nearly maybe more than 1 billion people have gone to elections. So anyway, but thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Brett. We're going to move on to our next panel, our final panel. And I'm going to welcome our speakers up here now. But thank you again, Brett. The microphones, but we are moving on to our next panel. This is the Arizona impact. So we're going to talk about Arizona. It's sort of like a bookend of talking about threats, globally and nationally, but bringing it back to Arizona, because I think for our listeners, for people here, and for us, everyone, Arizona is ground zero, along with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia. But so much has happened here over the past few years that we're really honored to have all of you who have great experience. So we have Bill Gates, our supervisor for Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. He's had a couple of stints as the chairman of Maricopa County, and he's become famous, as has Adrian Fontes, or infamous. Also, Sarah Gonski, a faculty associate in ASU elections law expert. And this is going to be moderated by Stephanie Tsai, anchor PBS NewsHour West. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. I don't do these things often because this is usually when I'm on the air, but I love the McCain Institute. I got to interview John McCain a couple of times when he was running for president. And I saw that Bill Gates was going to be on my panel. I interviewed Bill Gates about 6 months after the 2020 election. And he was in the midst of personal attacks from his own party, facing, I think, jail time or the threat of it. And all the way staunchly and courageously defending the rule of law. And I say that not as a journalist because I don't have opinions as a journalist, but as an Arizona voter. So it's an honor to be again with you. And I can only imagine what you're going through. Yeah, I think applause is warranted. I can only imagine what you're going through. The election has started, voting has begun here. 2 years ago, there was a printing issue. 2020, there was conspiracy theory from the get-go. Questions about the tabulation machines that you had to defend in and out of court and in the media. And now we're talking about artificial intelligence and generative intelligence. And I know you're on the way out from this position, but this is the best time to interview a politician. Like, where does this rank on your list of worries right now, Bill?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. It's just so honored to be with everyone here this evening. I think it would be naive to say that it doesn't rate high. It is a concern because our voters are concerned about it. People who are involved in elections are concerned about it. And I absolutely agree with the things that have been said before, that it's not a completely new phenomenon, right? It's sort of supercharging what we're dealing with. But the fact is that we live in a time now where any one of, we saw Secretary Fontes earlier. I've certainly seen and heard recordings of myself that getting up election day, those polls open at 6 o'clock, and at 6:05, someone could put a video out with me or one of my colleagues or Stephen Richer spreading lies. We're going to have to deal with that. We can all sit here and say, well, we all know that's not real. I mean, look, Bill has 6 fingers. Of course, that's not real, but we're going to have to deal with that. So we're ready for it. And the good news, I think, is that most of the way that we deal with it is in a very low-tech way. And there are certainly, some tools that are out there, but in the end, we're going to deal with it in a low-tech way, which is the same way that we dealt with things now for 4 years. Because unfortunately, we have been under attack, all of us here in Arizona. And so this has become a way of life. So it's different. But in a lot of ways, it's the same thing. The Groundhog's Day that we've been dealing with now for 4 years in Arizona elections.
I'm going to challenge everyone's point that this has all been seen before in a second, but I want to bring Sarah in on this conversation too, because I've been learning a lot more about her background, and she was also on the front lines post 2020. I mean, she was a lawyer at the time. She was working, I believe, with the DNC. She was directly involved in many of the cases that were brought to court by Republicans who were denying the results of the election. So you've also been a sort of a defender of democracy for the last 4 years. And now you've got 3 kids and you're teaching and you're in policy, but you are in policy. And a lot of what the last panel was talking about was what they were getting at is what policies are needed. Because when we talk about guardrails, aren't we talking about regulations and laws? And Bill, I'd like to ask you this question because you're a lawyer as well. What should be done in Arizona and maybe even federally, if you can comment, to sort of contain this?
Good question. And non-working microphone. Thank you. Does this one work? I might have to borrow one from you. Thank you. Yeah, wow. There's so much to do, I think, when it comes to AI and elections. I am not the AI expert, but we are working over here in elections, and we're seeing the way that it can be used for misinformation, can be used to scale up and disseminate the type of lies that used to be a little harder to do in an analog fashion. And now anybody can do it. I think that when it comes to what we need out of our policymakers, in deference to the great John McCain, I don't think that what we need is an overarching level of regulation right now where we have entirely new regulatory bodies at the outset. What we need to do is really get our arms around what this even is. And I think that that's happening at the federal level in a very confused and haphazard fashion right now. We're seeing it happen in state legislatures throughout the country in very limited fashion. I think in Arizona, for example, we've seen some legislation
Other states have seen similar that's focused on deep fakes in the campaign context. That's good. That's a start, but there's an enormous world of what impact AI can have in the elections administration space, both for bad and for good, that we can have that conversation, but we are not currently having that conversation.
Bill, do you have a perspective? I know that I have read that after you're done with your service as supervisor, you're planning to start this democracy lab at ASU. So I assume this is something you're going to be looking at. Do you see policies that could be enacted currently at the state level or the federal level to put some guardrails on generative AI?
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that we'll be looking at the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory. But I'm like Sarah, I'm hesitant, and this partially comes from my philosophy, my political philosophy. That we have to be careful about, starting to limit, especially we're talking about speech. I mean, that's what this is. We can call it, high tech, but this is speech. So we have to be very careful about it. But I love the comment that was made earlier. I think you made it about, with Facebook Live, it was like, oh, isn't this great? And then, oh no, there's this dark side to it. But with AI, and a great credit to those who work in the area, that we looked at it right out of the chute and said, we need to figure out, what guardrails should there be? What are the dangers that we're facing? And like every organization that I'm aware of has an AI committee. So it's great to see this very organic, that we're seeing in different organizations, private sector, public sector, higher education, that people are looking at this, studying it. That's a wonderful thing. And I'm sure that bubbling out of that, there will be some policy prescriptions. But even though we're thinking about it as we go into elections here, I don't think we know yet exactly what policies and laws ought to be passed.
So as everyone here knows, Maricopa County is the second largest voting county in the country, and one of the most important in the country as a swing county. So you said you're prepared for this. I just want to read something that challenges this notion that we've seen this all before, and this is just amplified. And this is directly from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's website, CISA. This is the agency that was started up to treat election infrastructure as critical national security infrastructure. And I'm sure glad we have that. But this is what it says on their website, quote, "For cyber incidents, malicious actors may use generative AI to help create strains of malware that can evade cybersecurity defenses. It may also enable more effective distributed denial of service attacks, which can take down websites, including election-related websites, by flooding them with massive amounts of data." Now, we know that DDoS attacks already occur, but what we're talking about, I think, and I'm not the expert, but generative AI can actually write code for malware. I don't know that we're there yet. I talked to Nadia before and she didn't think we were quite there, but is this something you're prepared for? Does CISA advise you and, Recorder Risher and Secretary Fontes on this stuff?
Yeah, and this is, I guess, one of the advantages that we have had the eyes of the world on us for so long, is that people understand that those who would do wrong and try and impact us negatively may very well focus on Arizona. So the partnerships that we have with the Secretary of State's office, with the FBI, with CISA, with local law enforcement are really remarkable. And I feel very fortunate to be here, because I look at some of these other jurisdictions out there where maybe you don't have that same sort of cooperation. But, interestingly, when you talk about this, and again, we talk about generative AI, and there may be intentional attempts to bring down systems, but we had the CrowdStrike situation that happened not that long ago. And I think that Arizona was one of the few jurisdictions that was actually we were actually going through a primary election at the time. So we had a bit of a dry run. And here's the amazing thing, because of the great folks who work in this area in Arizona, in the wee hours of the morning, they were aware of it. They were already addressing it. And very quickly in Maricopa County, we were able to get our systems back up and people were able to go in and do early voting. And I feel that it's incumbent upon me to mention that even though these things could occur, there are folks that, I mean, we have billions of attacks on, Maricopa County every quarter. But even if people might be able to address websites, we have to be very careful about that. Those tabulation machines are not connected to the internet. They are air gapped. And when we get down to it, what really, really matters in the end is that tabulation, the counting of the votes. And even though there are people out there who are saying that the votes in 2020 were affected by Italian satellites and German servers, they weren't, and they will not be in 2024.
Sarah, are all the other counties in Arizona prepared for this?
Well, that's a good question. So I think I work nationwide, including, and I live here in Phoenix. I am a Maricopa County voter. Thank you to you and to Secretary Fontes for making my elections very secure and knowing that my policymakers are on top of AI threats. But that is absolutely not the norm for what I see in a lot of other counties. A lot of this is a resource issue. Election administrators are carrying so much. We ask them to do so much with so little. The federal government spends more maintaining parking facilities every year than it spends on elections. Elections are often run through local taxes, local funding. We have a pretty good system in Maricopa County, but that is also because we have a pretty well-funded elections staff and department in Maricopa compared to a lot of other places, not just in the state, but compared to a lot of places nationwide. I have yet to meet an election official that tells me that they don't care about AI or they're not concerned. But I meet a ton of them who tell me I cannot prioritize learning more about AI and doing something more about it without dropping another mission critical task. So what we need to do, I think, first and foremost, when I'm thinking about what to tell policymakers about this is if you want election officials to know more about AI and look out for themselves, fund them. Give them money, give them people in their office, people that are maybe statewide resources that they can tap into. They need to be able to have trainings and resources to be able to get on top of this threat. We cannot keep expecting them to just add more things to the backpack that's already stuffed full.
That's a great point. Maricopa County, I would imagine, would be a better resource. Bill, you brought up this phrase earlier, low tech. That there's like low tech solutions to addressing a high tech problem, which also brings to mind another conversation you and I had earlier this week, which is that there's like this movement for hand counting, for getting away from the electronic voting machines, while there's like 70% of the population getting their news from an algorithm. How do you think about that? I mean, it's kind of mind blowing. You've got this like drive for low tech voting, and yet you have this potential for AI to help with voting systems. And then this threat in the information landscape from artificial intelligence. It's all happening at one time.
It is all happening, and I actually think it's all related because I think that's part of what's, and this is, and this is the thing. When we look at the concerns that some people have elections, we need to look behind it and where's this coming from? Where's this fear coming from? And I think part of it is this fear of change. And when you hear about generative AI and these things that we can't even wrap our brains around, you know what I can understand? I can understand counting pieces of paper. I can understand that. And that makes me feel good. So as opposed to, and I'm not saying that anyone in this room would, but as opposed to poo-pooing that, we got to figure out where's that concern coming from. And so although AI may have some answers for us and may help us in this process, we have to be careful. And that's something that I know we've done here, the elections officials in Arizona. And this was an issue actually on the 2020 election when our former Attorney General, Mark Brnovich, we got into it over this issue, whether we were using AI, whether the recorder was using AI. So this becomes a political issue as well. And again, it's incumbent upon us as elections officials to explain what is happening and what isn't happening. And it is, as was said earlier, it is a bit of a civics 101, but we have to do that. And fortunately, because we have the resources in Maricopa County and Arizona, and because we have the attention, because people are listening to us, we have the opportunity to walk people through what this is, what it isn't. Someone once called me Mr. Rogers when talking about it. Hey, that's fine. We are trying to explain this situation, which sometimes can be complicated. But you know what? We shouldn't just tell people, trust us. We should instead say, hey, let's talk about it. Let's show you how we do things. And that's exactly what we've done. I give our colleague, Stephen Richer, great credit for going on, X and explaining this in great detail to people. But then also that's why we've invited people down to the Maricopa County Tabulation Center. And I would invite everyone now, although not currently because we're in a blackout period, but when we're over with this election, come down. Let us walk you through. Let us show you how everything is an air gap system. So that's the only way we're going to win this battle. I think this information battle is through low tech, is through walking people through the system, is through shooting a video at 7 a.m. to explain to people, what door number 3 is. That was, and we had to do that because unfortunately there were people out there in 2022 who were trying to frighten voters and trying to, concern voters so much that they ended up spending hours standing at the polls when they could have simply put it in door 3, and the ballots were going to be tabulated later that day down at our central tabulation center. So that's what I mean when I say low tech solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. But, the issue all along has been the degradation of trust in institutions and the way that social media, even pre-generative AI, has accelerated the sense that we can't trust anybody and we don't know what's real. I imagine that's something we should expect going into November as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this is one, I'll say I'm more, my needle for AI is more on the doomer scale. So don't mistake me for being cheerleader here, but I will say that in the interest of talking about things that AI could do that could be useful in election administration, one of them is that election administrators, a lot of offices throughout the country are 1-2 people on staff for an entire county. They're not necessarily comms experts or graphics experts that can make a really good ad that they can put out. LA County translates their election materials into 18 different languages. They cannot hire somebody to do a radio ad or a TikTok ad if you want to reach the young voters in 18 different languages or anything like that. So there is a world in which you can see that AI could be useful for automating some of these election tasks. In particular, if AI is going to kill us through misinformation, it can also help us create pre-bunking materials that, academics have shown. There was just a study I saw today on the value of pre-bunking about how long election results should take to become final. And some academics looked at that and said, this is actually a very effective method, is to get out in front of the bad information with good information. But making that good information and getting it out there, it takes resources, it takes staff time. A lot of that can be done quicker if you can use generative AI for good in being able to create some voter materials, some good graphics that are helpful in various languages. But we do need to, if we're going to allow election officials to do that type of work through AI, we've got to have some guardrails on the process so that, as Supervisor Gates is saying, people can feel confident that AI is being used where it's useful, like for drafting translations in an initial draft that are later going to be looked at by a human, or by translating something from legalese into plain speak so that it can be put in voter-facing materials. Those are good uses of AI that could be helpful, but people can't trust that people are going to stick in that zone and not go into bad zone unless we have some sort of policies that say it is okay to use AI for some things, but not others. We should not be putting, for example, any private data into AI generators. That's a really simple policy solution that somebody can come up with. We'll see if they do.
Well, that goes into the point about, there's also, besides this drive for sort of low-tech hand counting, there's this drive for more transparency of the voter rolls, right? And more transparency of voter data. Do you see that as a potential potential problem in that generative AI, from my understanding, the way it works is through big swaths of data. So the more we make transparent, the more data it has to manipulate us. And you've talked earlier about an example of how that voter data might be used nefariously.
That's right. Yeah, we've absolutely seen this, that in a lot of state legislatures over the past couple of years, there's been a push to make more information about voting subject to public records requests. This has created some unintended consequences. In Texas, for example, under certain circumstances, people have been able to use this data to trace individual ballots back to individual voters because people aren't quite thinking through how many pieces of data you put online and if those can be triangulated by bots and things like that. So one of the things that I think legislatures and policymakers should be cautious about when they're thinking about making everything transparent by putting everything on the internet, that means that it's not just available for human beings to see and access and think about, it is also available for scraping to be able to use. And I think I was talking to an election official recently who was telling me that her great fear is that people would get personalized calls on election day that would be purporting to be from somebody saying, you know, hi, Stephanie, this is Bob, your local precinct captain. I'd like to talk to you about voting today, but I'd like to verify some of your information. Can you verify your address? Can you verify your date of birth? Okay, you are who you say you are. We have an active shooter situation. We have law enforcement on site. The courts have already extended polling hours from 7 p.m. until 10 p.m. So we are asking people to stay away until 7 p.m. and then you can come down and vote. And the issue is, I think this is similar to what Secretary Fontes was saying earlier, that he's worried that it would be him in the idea.
Mr.
But the idea of
Gates.
having an actual, not
Yeah.
just a video, we've seen the videos, but the fact that they can have a conversation and they can go through what appears to be a verifying process using data that they already have. The bot knows your date of birth. It knows where your address is. It got that from the same database it got your phone number. The idea that it could have a really authentic seeming conversation is terrifying.
Well, we've all heard about the Biden call. And I think that was the moment at which I really sort of freaked out about the potential. And I don't know, Bill, if you have anything else to add before, I'm going to, in a minute, bring up the rest of the panelists so the audience can ask any further questions. But do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, again, I feel like, I mean, these are all the things that we have to be prepared for. I mean, it used to be we had essentially no comms people at Maricopa County on election day. Now we have a team in a room that's monitoring all the different types of social media. We're going to continue to do that. And as soon as we hear the wonderful thing is we have thousands of people who run an election in Maricopa County. So that's a lot of eyes and ears out there. And as they find these things out, we have a rapid response that we can do. But part of it too is deciding which ones do we respond to and which ones we don't, because we don't want to be Chicken Little too. So it's, you know, it's something that we all, unfortunately, we have great professionals who help advise us on how to move forward with this. But bottom line is low tech is good. We're going to continue to use it to battle the high tech tools that are out there. And we would be naive to say that we don't expect people that are going to continue to try and disrupt these elections, unfortunately. But through the partnerships that we have, we're ready for that and grateful for everyone in this room and out there on Zoom that are doing the same and will be helping us.
All right. I think I need to leave it there timing wise for this panel, but please stay on. And then if we can bring up, thank you both so much. That was really interesting. If we can bring on Secretary Fontes and Nadia Bliss and Brett as well, in case anyone else has questions. And I guess you can just raise your hands. Yeah, here, I'll bring my microphone over.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm a semi-retired software engineer. And I was wondering if anybody knows, how did Putin predict that Trump would be a preeminent leader in spreading disinformation?
I don't think there was any direct prediction from one leader to the next leader. I think, you know, if you look back at a lot of the ways that the former Soviet Union
has spent its time and energy manipulating other countries and other spaces. But this isn't new stuff for them. We have a uniquely open society here, and we have a very, very generally sort of a big playing field. And the way that our foreign adversaries have been acting is really, they pounced, I think, on an opportunity. And I don't know that this direct correlation that your question implies is such that one could have predicted the other. I think the circumstances arose, and I don't think that it was just Russia. Again, I think China is very interested in our petrification, in our sort of getting us to the place where we can't move, where we can't govern, where we can't respond globally. I think Iran is in the same space, and they have the capacity to capitalize on our openness. And so while our openness has been our strength in creating opportunity in entrepreneurship, in music, in medicine, in technology, and et cetera, it also has its vulnerabilities. And that falls to us as citizens to protect this, not necessarily to any particular leader. So I think we have that responsibility. I wouldn't put it just on any one or small group of individuals.
I just think that's a great point that goes back to Bill Gates's First Amendment point, which is that a lot of what we've seen in these elections are a direct result of the rights that we have in this country, which is that the First Amendment allows us and makes it very difficult to regulate. I mean, Brazil the other day just shut down Twitter. You know, they just shut it down, and we're not going to do that. And so they're exploiting what makes this country so strong, what always has. And that's what we've got to figure out. Okay, I think there's a question.
Thanks. It's, I think, a good follow-up. I've noticed some media making some changes. You've seen fact checking, community notes, et cetera. Do you think that the media is moving in the right direction? Are they making some of the important changes that are necessary?
So this is, this is one of my things I say as a Republican. It's Republican. The Republicans in the room know what I'm talking about. We were all taught in Republican school not to talk to the media. And it has now taken me the last few years to understand, no, that's not a good idea. You actually need to tell the media what's going on, and they can help tell the story. The people that we are dealing with who are spreading misinformation have millions and millions of followers on social media. I don't. Maybe Adrian does, but I don't. But when I can go and my colleagues can go to the media, and they have done an incredible job of learning elections in the last 4 years. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to our local media here in Arizona that has done an incredible job of getting these stories out there. So with the First Amendment, there are always challenges, but all these stories of, well, the media is gone and there's no journalists left and it's all TikTok. I'm here to tell you it's not true. And they are doing an incredible job of getting the truth out there. And that's why we've done another low-tech thing in Maricopa County. 2022, we did 16 good old-fashioned press conferences. We in person, real people standing around, and journalists were there to ask us questions and learning about how elections work and getting the truth out. So I give great credit. Is the media perfect? No, no one is. But I think they've done an incredible job of getting the truth out.
Just to add, I mean, when I started in 2017, the questions that we would get about Russia's information operation were very unsophisticated. It was generally like, what's the wildest piece of fake news you've seen? And you go, this is not really how this works, right? They kind of latch onto real things and check. And so the level of sophistication has gotten much better. Many of the big outlets have hired people who have specific training in open source intelligence, who can verify videos and verify images. So they brought on experts onto their staff. So it's much, much better. And then they've clearly become more sophisticated about hack and leaks and how they respond to them and report on them. So you go back to the Podesta leaks and everything that happened in 2016. We know the Trump campaign was hacked. And we know the Iranians have attempted to get that information published, and it hasn't happened. I mean, I'm sure you can find it somewhere online, but the Harris campaign didn't publish it. Politico and others who they reached out to didn't publish it. So I think they have learned and have gotten much better at reporting on this in general, but specifically dealing with information manipulation threats that require them to play an active part, which they haven't this cycle.
Hi, Joe Duhonik. I'm a reporter with Courthouse News. For Secretary Fontes, you're talking about training election workers to recognize AI, whether it's deepfake videos or just misinformation. Is the purpose of that so that election workers can then help members of the public stave off that same kind of thing? Or is there a fear that election workers or poll workers themselves can be manipulated by AI in a way that can affect election integrity? And if that's the case, can you give an example of what that might look like?
Well, so all of the above and then some, right? I think what we really wanted to do was give our election workers, and also in the other workshops, law enforcement and the media, give them the space to explore what this is about. Give them a comfortable space to ask questions about it, to familiarize them with it. I would liken it to, orientation when you get to your first year as an undergraduate. Right? You go, you hang out, you learn where the cafeteria is, you learn where the library is. Am I dating myself a little bit here? And really kind of familiarizing them with the landscape so that they can do all of the above. They can help voters who may have questions and the folks that they need to be supporting so that they are less likely to be manipulated themselves. And even with some of the lower tech things that we've done, in our office, we're intercepting phishing attempts all the time. And our staff, our security folks actually are commending our staff and they're saying, wow, that was a great phishing attempt that you captured and highlighting this. So we're really kind of increasing the skill level insofar as recognizing and reacting to these sorts of things, because it's critical that those folks stay focused on the fundamentals. Right? We don't want folks kind of learning and getting all excited about these sorts of things or even scared about these things as they're administering the election, because as anybody who's run elections knows, the clock's not stopping for anybody, right? When we hit the last day to vote at 7 p.m., that's it. We're done. And knock on wood, nobody's still standing in line, but we're done. And nothing stops the next thing and the next thing. So we've got to stay focused. And the general idea was to make sure that if that sort of thing happens, we're able to react with a cool head and just deal with it and then move along to the rest of the election stuff. So sort of yes to all of the above and then a bunch more. Yeah.
Does anyone else? Okay. I feel like Oprah over here. You get a car.
I get a car. Thank you all. This has been fascinating. But I want to ask a question and have you maybe play out something for me that alarms me the most about all this. So I agree, absolutely, very well done elections in Arizona. And I think any reasonable observer, having seen what has happened in the last 4 years and the last 2 years, has to admit that. Having said that, I'd be very interested to know your thoughts on what happens when I think part of the reason those institutions work so well is particularly in 20 and 22, they were led by people of integrity, one of whom's here, actually two of whom are here, but, and mad respect to Stephen Richer, right, who had to spend a lot of time bucking his own party and going through a lot of grief in doing that. So my concern is what you think happens when we elect somebody to lead those institutions, who currently is campaigning as the election denier. I want you to play that out for me in your mind. How much should we be worried? Is this someone that gets into office and is co-opted by actually being able to see in front of them, wow, it really does work? Or is it someone who takes the institution in the other direction?
Well, first of all, as to Mr. Richer, if he hadn't campaigned so hard against me and beaten me, he wouldn't have had to deal with any of that stuff. It would still be in my office. No, I love the guy. He's an earnest fellow. Let me answer that with an example of one jurisdiction in Arizona that will remain unnamed, where an appointment into one of these election administration offices happened. The appointment was by some folks who were, let's just say, enthusiastic about elections. And the individual who was appointed had been a co-enthusiast to a great degree. And a couple of weeks into the work, having learned about the processes, having learned about the people who run the process in that office, this individual is now one of the best cheerleaders that the current and then present systems have. We can go down these paths when we don't know any better, but most reasonable people understand the caveat there. I think once they really see, as Bill so eloquently put out, bring them in, that low-tech tour, right? When you see the checks and balances and when you understand what's happening in there, the edge tends to soften significantly. And I think, and Bill, I'll give you the mic in a minute, because we've seen this over and over and over again. We've seen it play out. Is that going to happen with any one particular individual? I don't know. But I do know that there are examples out there of folks who were election deniers who went and learned and saw and experienced and came around and are now not occupying that space.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is the key, I think, is humanization. Okay. It is real easy. And I think some of the loudest election deniers out there right now who are elected officials aren't involved in elections. They're in other offices. And so it's easy for them. They know it's clickbait. They know they're going to raise money to criticize. But this is what I always say almost every day. Elections are not run by faceless bureaucrats. They're not run by robots. They're run by people. And once you have the opportunity to get to know these people and understand that they've been doing this for 20 and 30, 40 years, so they're experts at it and they're good people. But really, in the end, the bottom line is you don't know what those people are going to do until they're sitting on the dais, until they're in that office. And I can tell you right now, I've learned more about myself than I ever could have imagined by being an elected official. And every single person I know who's an elected official, I know them better because I saw how they dealt with these situations. It really does get down to character. And so I can't tell you who has good character and who doesn't until they're actually in those positions.
I'll end the question with a note of hope, which is that in Colorado, there was an elected official, Tina Peters, many of you may have recognized that name, but who came in and was elected and was really entrusted with the people of that county to run elections in that county, came in and completely betrayed the trust of democracy and of the people there, handed over a lot of equipment to bad actors, did everything that she could to really get in the way of the smooth functioning of that office. And the hopeful note is that people swarmed in to help. People from all over Colorado, I've talked to election officials who went in and got the call. They were retired and got the call saying, come in and help. We have to run this election because we have somebody here who's completely flown off into the ether and left this thing. People dropped vacations. People did everything that they could to go into that office to help to make sure that voters' data was secure, to make sure that the equipment was getting back up to speed, to make sure that that equipment went off and that election went off without a hitch. And Tina Peters, just a few weeks ago, was just sentenced to 9 years in prison for that act. And if you need a pep talk at any point over the next couple of weeks about our election, I highly encourage you to go watch the YouTube clips of the judge at that sentencing hearing, because for anybody that has been, I can't imagine how it must have felt for Secretary Fontes and Supervisor Gates. I hope that you have seen it. I hope you play it every night because you guys have both been really at the front lines of this. But the amount to which the judge expressed disappointment and talked about how this election and this democracy was bigger than one person who was going to try to thwart it should make all of us rest at least a little bit easier as we go into the election and are not sure whether any election deniers are going to take office. There are helpers everywhere. They will come out. Democracy will prevail.
Sarah, I'm so glad. I see Paul there, so I think I'm supposed to end. I think that was a great note to end on, which has been my observation. I covered the 2016, the 2020, the 2022, is that for all of the existential questions that are being posed to our country and our democracy right now, as somebody who's lived overseas, who's lived in communist China, our system is holding. It's holding. It's held. You were part of the court cases. You were part of it. You were part of it. You're going to be part of it again, probably. And it's holding. Paul, I'll let you say goodnight.
Everyone on this panel, said it all, but thank you well, many of you for your service, for everything that you're doing to protect democracy, to prevent, future efforts to undermine our democracy. But I think Bill said it. I mean, like low tech, and it's people you trust. It comes down to character. When it comes to elections and democracy. But I don't want to take any more time of anyone, but I want to thank our panelists for coming out tonight and being with us. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. And online.